On August 27, 1883, the Indonesian island of Krakatoa exploded. Like many of the islands in Indonesia, Krakatoa was volcanic. The result of the explosion was that everything on the island, every plant, every animal, every person, died. 2 years after the explosion, a Dutch scientist went to Krakatoa to see what was left, and his conclusion was that the island had become completely sterile, that nothing would ever live on the island of Krakatoa ever again. Interestingly, though, 3 years later, another expedition went there, and what they found was something which no one had expected to see. There were small shoots of plants that were starting to grow out of the ashen soil. Turns out that there were seeds in the ground on Krakatoa which had laid dormant for years, perhaps even hundreds of years. These harder seeds that couldn't just be opened through the normal processes, but it was actually the fires of the volcanic explosion actually opened up these harder seeds that nothing else had been able to do. And I can't help but think about Krakatoa and think about our own lives as well. That sometimes there are situations and circumstances which we might consider cataclysmic or devastating. And in fact, sometimes it's those very fiery trials themselves, the heat of them, which opens up the seeds that lay dormant in our life. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul says an incredible thing. Starting in verse 8, he says, "We want you to know, brothers, about the trials that we experienced in the province of Asia." And he says this, "We were so greatly distressed beyond our ability to endure, that we despaired of life itself." It's interesting that Paul says, "I don't want you to be uninformed of these things, brothers," because the whole premise of the book of 2 Corinthians is that there were people who were criticizing the Apostle Paul because he suffered so many afflictions. They accused him. They said, "Look, it's somebody who suffers as much as Paul suffers. Surely he can't be a real man of God." Later on, at the end of 2 Corinthians in chapter 11, Paul the Apostle, he says this, "If I must boast, I will boast in the things that show my weakness." Now, why in the world would anyone boast about the things that show their weakness? Who does that? Well, Paul did it, and he tells us why, starting in verse 9. He says, "Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death," but check this out, he says, "but this happened so that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead." Paul says, here's the reason why I'm not embarrassed or ashamed of my afflictions and sufferings. Because at those moments when I came to the end of myself, that is when I stopped relying on myself and I found real strength by turning to the Lord. You know, it's interesting that in the Christian life, what we come to realize is that real weakness is relying on our own strength, but true strength is found in recognizing our weaknesses, because our weaknesses press us into God, and that's where we find true strength. It's interesting, if you look through the Bible, you'll notice that all of the most beautiful people in the Bible, the people who we consider truly beautiful, all of them had incredible weaknesses in their lives. Moses stuttered, Jacob limped, Tamar was assaulted, Ruth was widowed in her youth, Sarah was infertile, Mordecai was bullied, Hosea's wife was unfaithful to him, Elijah battled depression, all the prophets were persecuted, Mary and Joseph had to flee a corrupt government, John Mark got fired by Paul, Peter denied Jesus in a moment of fear. But what's interesting is that all of these people, in their weakness, it wasn't just that they had these weaknesses, but actually that God used these weaknesses in order to do great things through them. In other words, why would they be ashamed of their weaknesses? The weakness was the very thing that God used to accomplish his mighty works through them. And so as we consider this, that times of tribulation provide unprecedented opportunities for growth and for God's work, I just want to encourage you that in those times that you face, perhaps they are times in which God is preparing the ground for new growth. Perhaps he's using the fire of those trials to open up those seeds that have laid dormant for years so that he can do something in and through you that he couldn't have done otherwise. So God bless you, and thanks so much.